The sky above the valley burned with streaks of crimson, and gold as the last. Light of day faded behind the jagged mountains. Dust swirled across the dry earth, and the faint scent of smoke lingered from the distant forest fires. A little girl with tear-streaked cheeks clutched the frayed hem of her tattered dress, her small body trembling as she stumbled along the deserted dirt road. Her tiny hands were scratched and blistered from running, her bare feet leaving shallow imprints in the hot, cracked soil. "Please, take her." "Not me," she whispered, her voice breaking into sobs that were swallowed by the wind. She didn't know if anyone could hear her, didn't know if anyone even cared. Her mother had vanished weeks ago, leaving her alone in a world that had suddenly turned cruel and unforgiving. Hunger gnawed at her stomach. Exhaustion threatened to pull her down to the ground, but she kept moving, desperate to escape the shadowy figures she could sense, following her in the distance. Somewhere beyond the hills, a rancher was returning home from his long day, checking fences and tending the livestock. He was a man of few words, his broad shoulders and calloused hands evidence of a life forged in hard labor. He had seen tragedies before, but nothing like the fragile, frightened girl running across his property. When he spotted her, a strange mix of anger and sorrow gripped his chest. She looked like she had been through hell, and yet there was a spark in her eyes that refused to be extinguished. Without hesitation, he vaulted over the low fence and approached her, his shadow stretching long across the dirt road. The girl froze, panic flaring as she tried to move past him, but her legs failed her and she collapsed onto the ground with a pitiful whimper. "Please, take her." "Not me," she repeated, curling into herself. The rancher knelt down slowly, keeping his hands visible so she wouldn't fear him, and spoke softly, though his voice carried the weight of authority. "You're safe now," he said, though she flinched at the sound, unsure whether to trust him. He extended one massive hand toward her, palm open. The girl hesitated, but something in the steadiness of his gaze urged her to reach out. The moment her fingers brushed his, he lifted her effortlessly into his arms, her tiny body trembling against his chest. She felt the solidity of him, the warmth that felt foreign after nights spent shivering alone, and for a fleeting second she imagined she could breathe without fear. He turned his gaze toward the road behind them, seeing the flicker of movement from those who had been chasing her, but they were too far to reach her now. Without a word, he hoisted not only the girl but also the small bundle she had been carrying, a dog, battered and limping, with matted fur and soulful eyes, and carried them both back toward his ranch. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows that mingled with the dust and smoke. The girl finally dared to peek up at him, her voice barely audible. Why are you helping me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he continued walking, his stride purposeful, as though the explanation could wait until they were safe inside the walls of his home. That night, under the dim glow of lanterns, he laid the girl on a bed of blankets in the corner of the barn, the dog curled protectively beside her, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the fragile stirrings of hope. The rancher watched silently from the doorway, his jaw tight, his eyes reflecting memories he had buried deep within himself. Memories of loss, betrayal, and the quiet ache of loneliness. He wasn't a man given to sentiment, but there was something about her courage, her fierce insistence that she survive, that stirred something in him he hadn't felt in years. Outside, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying with it the faint scent of rain and renewal. Somewhere in the distance, the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky, tiny beacons of hope in a world that had seemed determined to crush her. The girl slept fitfully, nightmares clawing at her even in the brief reprieve of safety, and the rancher stayed near, guarding her as one would a treasure too precious to risk losing. The night stretched long and cold, but he didn't falter. He had made a silent vow. No harm would come to her while he was alive. Morning brought a brittle sunlight and the distant crow of a rooster. The girl awoke to find the rancher already tending the animals, moving with a precision and strength that was mesmerizing. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, and for a moment she thought the events of the previous night had been a dream, but the dog nudged her hand, and the memory of his massive arms lifting her stayed vivid. The rancher noticed her stirring and walked over, offering a tin cup of milk. Hesitant, she took it, the warmth of the liquid seeping into her bones. "You'll need to eat," he said simply. She nodded, unable to form words, her throat still raw from crying. He didn't press further. Instead, he guided her outside. showing her how to help with the feeding of chickens and the tending of the smaller animals. Each task was simple, yet it carried with it a lesson in discipline, patience, and the quiet rhythm of life that could exist even in a world so cruel. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the little girl began to heal both in body and spirit. She learned the names of the horses, the habits of the cattle, and the intricate patterns of the land. Yet for all the routines, she never let her guard down completely, haunted by memories of the shadowy figures that had pursued her. The rancher watched her carefully, sensing the fractures beneath her brightening eyes, the invisible scars that clung to her even as she laughed or tended the animals. There were nights when she would wake screaming, and he would carry her back to her corner in the barn, murmuring words meant to soothe, though he could not promise what she wanted most, her mother's return. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in violent shades of orange and purple, a distant rider appeared on the horizon. The girl froze, recognizing the figures too late, and a scream tore from her throat. The rancher reacted instantly, snatching her up and positioning himself between her and the approaching threat. The rider slowed, and in that moment of hesitation, the rancher's presence radiated a silent warning. Whoever they were, they knew better than to challenge him. They passed by, but the terror lingered, leaving the girl shaking in his arms. He set her down, brushing the dirt from her hair, and for the first time he spoke words heavy with truth. "You are not alone anymore. Not now, not ever." That night, she finally allowed herself to rest without fear gnawing at her chest, clinging to him as a lifeline, and he allowed himself to feel a bond forming that he had long thought impossible. They were both survivors, forged by pain, and somehow, in the desolate landscape that had threatened to destroy her, they had found each other. It wasn't a conventional family, not yet, and perhaps never fully, but it was a bond that neither could break, one built on trust, protection, and the unspoken promise that no matter how dark the world became, they would face it together. Months passed, and the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. The little girl grew stronger, her laughter echoing across the fields, carrying with it a resilience that amazed even the rancher. He taught her to ride horses, to read the subtle cues of the animals, and to navigate the rugged terrain with confidence. Each day she proved that the horrors of her past would not define her. One morning, the tranquility of the ranch was shattered by the arrival of a group of strangers. They came with official papers, a sternness in their expressions, and a determination that spoke of bureaucracy and law rather than cruelty. The girl's heart pounded. Had they come for her? The rancher stepped forward, his posture imposing yet measured. "She's not going anywhere," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. The strangers protested, citing regulations, legal guardians, and the responsibilities of the state. But the rancher stood firm, his hand steady on the reins of his horse, his eyes locked on theirs. The girl, seeing his resolve, felt a surge of courage she hadn't known she possessed. She stepped forward, her small hand gripping his sleeve. "Please," she whispered, "I want to stay with him. He saved me." The strangers hesitated, taken aback by the raw sincerity in her eyes. The rancher didn't waver. He had seen too much suffering, felt too many losses, to relinquish this fragile spark of life he had fought so hard to protect. In the end, they left, muttering about legalities and paperwork, but unable to break the unspoken bond that now existed between the two. That night, under a sky bursting with stars, the girl lay in the barn, her head on the familiar blanket, her hand resting lightly on the dog. The rancher sat nearby, polishing tools, reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought her into his life. He was a man who had lived with silence and solitude for too long, and yet he found himself unwilling to return to that emptiness. She had become part of his world, and in ways he hadn't anticipated, his world had become hers as well. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and slowly, the wounds of the past faded, though they never disappeared entirely. They became scars, reminders of survival, of courage, of the unyielding strength that could emerge even in the darkest of times. The little girl thrived under his protection, her spirit unbroken, her laughter a balm to the hard, rugged life of the rancher. And though he rarely spoke of it, each time he watched her sleep, each time he felt her tiny hand slip into his, he knew he had been given a second chance at something he had long thought. Impossible, family not born of blood, but forged in the crucible of shared pain, trust, and unwavering devotion. The valley, once empty and silent, now rang with life, laughter, and the quiet Strength of two souls who had found each other in a world that had tried to tear them apart. The wind carried their story across the fields, a tale of survival, courage, and the unbreakable bond between a little girl and the rancher who had lifted her, and the dog, and in doing so, lifted himself as well, out of the shadows of solitude and into a light neither had dared hope for.